Hey class, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the first chapter of the textbook. I'm going to do a little mini series, so mini lectures, kind of summarize some information from the textbook and kind of try to hit some of the most important parts. So this first chapter is really about why learn ethics? What's the point? What is ethics? Why should we be learning it? And it's, I guess, a good place to start because what is ethics? And ethics is kind of the study of what is right versus what is wrong. And that's why it's a very gray area because who gets to determine what is right and what is wrong? How do we determine what is right and what is wrong? And that's a question we'll be asking throughout this class and kind of looking at and applying to different business issues. So it starts off kind of talking about what you should know about ethics and when you think about ethics and why you should learn about ethics. So first, you should develop the knowledge and skills to recognize an issue, and I think that's important. We face millions of decisions at every second of the day. There's so many decisions to make all the time, and so knowing when a decision is going to have an ethical impact is something that you should know because we make decisions so quickly and so fast. Sometimes we don't really think about, oh, that was an ethical issue. And so knowing when to recognize when an issue is an ethical issue is a good first step. We're also going to learn a little bit about why people behave unethically. And I think almost all the time it comes to justification. You can justify anything to yourself. So people don't necessarily always think that they're bad people, even if they do bad things. So being able to justify that to yourself is mostly why people behave unethically. And lots of people do it all the time. Even me, I'm sure. The next thing we're going to kind of think about in this class and what we're going to talk about in the first discussion board is how ethical you are as a person. And like I said, everybody thinks that they're a good person, probably. Most people think they're good people. Or if they think they're a bad person, they don't care. Or else, if they did care, they probably wouldn't do the things that are bad. So, unless they have to. There's all sorts of scenarios and situations. So, how ethical you are as a person, you might think that you're a very good person, but maybe you've never been faced with a scenario where you've had to do something bad, or there wasn't enough options, or um, there could be many things like having to steal food because you don't have any kind of situation. Most people would say that's not bad, but stealing is bad. There's not really any good results in that situation. But thinking about your moral code and what you believe and kind of having that laid out and thinking about that, I think is really important because the more you think about how you would react in a situation, the more likely you are to actually act that out in that situation. So the next thing you're going to want to think about is we're going to be applying, obviously, what you learn about ethics to different business scenarios and situations. And then you'll also get to think a little bit about policies that you should be supporting, laws, things that are going on in society that you should support versus that you shouldn't support based on an ethical standpoint. That's kind of the first section of the chapter, kind of talks about. The next section talks a little bit more about like what are ethics, and it's kind of what we believe to be right versus wrong. And there's different norms that we follow as a society and different standards of practices that we implement and that we follow as a society. It's what you're expected to do. Not everybody does what they're expected to do, but it is what you're expected to do. And then I really like the question he posed, thinking about ethics. Is what is being done what should be done? So, is what is currently happening, is what we do as a society, what we should be doing ethically? And you're going to want to think about that as we go through this course. Kind of, are we doing what we should be? Another thing is we'll be talking about you as an individual, your morals, and also your part in society and how moral you are being in society. So I guess a better way to put that is like you might have individual values and morals and ways that you act as a person, but how do you interact as part of the society and are you doing ethical things as part of the society? Something we'll be talking about, thinking about. The next section kind of talks a little bit about how hard it is to teach ethics because ethics is, it's hard to teach. It's something that you kind of learn as you get older. It's not something that I can necessarily implement and make you into the most perfectly ethical being that you can be, but it's something that you have to know, and something you have to decide for yourself. There's a big gap, like I've mentioned, between knowing what is right. And so in this class, I can ask you all day, like, what would you do in this scenario? What would you do in this scenario? And you can say, oh, I would never do this, or I would always report this, or I would do it this way because this is the most ethical way to do it. And we know that that's the most ethical way to do things, but that doesn't mean we necessarily do it. A lot of people don't do those things, even if they do know that that is the most ethical course of action. And so there's a big gap there between what we know is right and what we do. And so trying to bridge that gap, I think, is important, in doing what you think that you should do in that moment, and recognizing that and not trying to justify what you're actually doing. So I like how they ask, like, why even teach this? But I think this class will really help, especially with responsible decision making in business and in other places possibly. But it will help you kind of think through the decision-making process and how to make the most ethical decision. The next section talks a little bit about laws and ethics and why they are different. So they are different because even if you're like following all the laws and being perfectly legal in all your actions, especially for businesses, that doesn't always mean that you're being the most ethical person or business. There are plenty of ways to circumvent the laws. There's plenty of loopholes. There's plenty of laws that aren't even in place yet because because we just haven't encountered the issue, but that doesn't mean that the action is ethical just because it's within the boundaries of the law. Like I said, laws don't get put in place until we need them for the most part. So a good example is like AI use and using AI in jobs and stuff like that, and using likenesses, like different celebrities and stuff, as AI, and laws in place, but is that ethical? That's something to talk about and think about. And we're working on laws, I think, currently. So it's a new issue, but just because there aren't laws in place doesn't mean it's ethical. And the opposite is also true. If a law is in place, that doesn't necessarily mean it is the ethical thing to do. And one of the best examples of this is in Nazi Germany, when if you hid a Jew from the government, then that was illegal. That was against the law. But obviously, it's the most ethical course of action, and it was the most ethical thing to do. So, like I said, law doesn't mean you're being ethical. Following the law doesn't mean you're being ethical. And being ethical can be outside the law, I guess. So those are not the same. And a lot of businesses just say they need to follow the law, and that's not true. They should try to go further and actually be ethical companies and businesses and ethical people. The next section of the chapter is kind of weird. I don't really love the author's interpretation of ethical relativism. Ethical relativism. Yep. I think he really focuses on the individualistic part of it, where I see it as more of a society thing. So he thinks that, like, it's more about, if I think something's right and you think something's wrong, as long as I think it's right, it's right. My opinion is the same as yours. And opinions can be the same on some things, like food preferences, color preferences, like green being the best color, etc. And opinions are equally valid, I think, on those things. Whether you like this color or that color, or this food or that food, that's a personal preference. All opinions are kind of equal on that, I believe. But there are things that you can have an opinion on and be wrong. Like, your opinion is not as valid as another opinion. Like, if my opinion is, I think the grass looks pretty purple. That's if you take actual facts and objectives and look at that, that's not a very valid opinion. That's not a good opinion. It's kind of an out there example, but that's my point, is like, if you can have an opinion on something and be wrong. So that's why he feels that ethical relativism is not a good theory. But I know ethical relativism, wow, I'm struggling with that today, as more of a cultural thing. So as long as society and your culture say that it's an ethical thing, it's an ethical thing. And I think that's wrong because there are many instances of society or cultures doing things that are wrong, like burning people because they think they're witches. That was totally accepted in many societies and small towns and villages, etc. And that doesn't mean it was okay. It was not okay. It was not ethical. It was not moral. But society said it was. So ethical relativism would say that that was ethical, and it's not. So that's why it's argued against as a theory. We can't just say that because society says something's okay, that it's okay. We should look at it objectively and decide if it's okay or not okay. So, and other examples are like child labor in some countries, it's accepted. Does that mean it's okay? No. Bribery. There's even some tribes have cannibalism in their tribes and different areas, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's an okay practice, even though they accept it and they say it's okay. So that covers that. I'm sorry that section's a little confusing. Yeah, like I said, I don't think the author did a great job on that. So you can look up some more if you want to know a little bit more about that topic. Finally, the chapter ends with talking about ethical decision making and kind of the steps to that. And I do like these steps. I think they're pretty handy if you actually go through them every time you're faced with a difficult decision. So first off, you gotta know the facts. You gotta know everything involved with what's going on and know what's actually true versus what's not true. I think that's very important, knowing the facts. Next is identifying what the core issue is. What is the actual problem and knowing the facts for that actual problem. The biggest step, I think, and the most important one towards determining what is ethical and what is not is who is affected, looking at who is affected. So who are the stakeholders? And stakeholders are anybody who's impacted by a decision. So it could be as a business, it could be your customers, it could be your employees, it could be your shareholders, it could be your board of directors, it could be your management, everybody who is affected, even customers, everybody who is impacted by your decision. You have to look at how all of those groups are going to be impacted. Who's going to be hurt, who's going to be better off, how is that decision going to impact people? And what choices are available is the next one. What are the options? What just picking one route and going with it isn't a good idea. Obviously, you want to think about different options that are available to different decisions that you can make. One of the biggest things that I've heard a lot in business and when it comes to making decisions is, would you want this to be on the front page of the newspaper? And that's kind of asking, what would society think about this decision? Would they think that you made the right decision, or would they criticize you for it? How would you feel about everybody knowing that the decision you made is this? Would you think it's good? Would you think it's bad? How do you feel? If you wouldn't want anybody to know that that's the decision you made, it's probably not the right decision. If you're feeling guilty about the decision you made, it might not be the best decision. So you need to be able to stand behind the decision that you make. And then finally, once you do make a decision, monitor it, figure out, watch what happens, watch the consequences of that decision and learn from that. So there might have been people that you didn't know were going to be impacted there might be consequences that you weren't aware of, and that ended up being bad. So just monitoring that, learning from that, and honestly, just being upfront and honest about it, I think is important when it comes to ethical decision making. So that wraps up chapter 1, and I will see you guys all again for chapter 2. And I'm going to stop this recording.